Welcome to the 104th episode of the New Ventures podcast. I am your host, Sanjoy Sanyal, the founder of Regain Paradise, a boutique climate finance firm and a visiting fellow at the Cambridge Judge Business School. Along with my co-host, Professor Jaideep Prabhu, we try and understand the links between climate change and food security in these series of conversations.
Hi, my name is Jaideep Prabhu. I'm a professor of marketing at the Cambridge Judge Business School. My area of research is innovation, more specifically frugal innovation, how to do more and better with less. And it's through my interest in frugal innovation that I have also become interested now in food security. I'm delighted to be joining Sanjoy on this podcast.
Our guest for today is Dr. Aditi Mukherjee, Principal Scientist, International Livestock Research Institute. In her previous role at CGIAR, she was the Director, Climate Change Impact Area Platform. Welcome, Aditi.
Thank you, Sanjay, and thank you, Jaideep. Just delighted to be on this podcast and speak with both of you.
Aditi, it's always a pleasure to have somebody who has a link with Cambridge. And so maybe we could start there. What was your time like at Cambridge? What did you study and what are some of the highlights of that experience?
Oh, yeah, I think those 3 years were some of the best in my life. I was in Cambridge from 2003 to 2006. I did my PhD in human geography. I was based in Fitzwilliam College. My supervisor was Bhaskar Veera, and my PhD topic was also around agriculture and food systems. I had in my PhD looked at kind of like low cost innovations. I had looked at how farmers, particularly smallholder farmers, manage water and what are the incentives that they face in managing water. For example, I worked in West Bengal, my home state. There we looked at how, due to the kind of energy policies that the state had, even though groundwater is quite available in the state, but the very fact that there wasn't any electricity available made farmers depend much more on diesel pumps and the kind of low-cost innovations that they were doing to manage water in a situation where a lot of the scarcity was like policy-induced rather than natural water scarcity that you have in much of India. My PhD work was on understanding the paradox when you have enough water but you have policy constraints. How do farmers manage water versus when you have actual natural water scarcity, but no policy constraint, farmers can basically get free water. How do farmers manage water? So I kind of dealt with that kind of paradox in my PhD, and I had fantastic time those 3 years. I was a Gates Cambridge Scholar, by the way. It was one of the early years. I think the Gates Cambridge Scholarship started in 2001. I was one of the recipients in 2003. So that was another exciting part of my stay in Cambridge.
Well, that's very impressive also that you are a Gates Scholar. And as you said, those would be one of the early years. It had just been started. This nexus between water and energy is fascinating. And those problems persist, I believe. You have all kinds of variations, like where electricity is given free and then farmers use that free energy to pump water excessively out of the soil. Have you stayed with that topic over the years, and what's the current status on that subject?
Yeah, I have kind of been quite fortunate to be able to stay on that subject for a very long time, till I would say recent years. I was also able to lead the IPCC water chapter in the last assessment cycle. So water and energy have been kind of two of my core research themes in all those 20 plus of my career. A lot of those issues persist. So to give you concrete examples, government tries to come up with innovations within the constraints. For the states in India, for example, which gets free electricity, taking away that free electricity is almost like a political harakiri. I mean, almost no government tries to do that. And we are all aware of the farmers' protests recently, even against taking away some of those privileges and the subsidies that the farmers have been getting. So increasingly what the electricity departments have been doing, they are getting kind of innovative. So one of the things they do in those states is ration electricity. And what they have done is they have separated the grids that go to the villages, to the domestic use, gets 24 hours low voltage electricity, one phase electricity, not necessarily low voltage, but one phase. And some of those states like Punjab, Haryana get only 6 to 8 hours of farm electricity, which is three phase electricity. And they have basically invested in two parallel networks, one that's domestic, one that's agricultural, simply because of the inability to price electricity. So I won't call it frugal innovation. It's quite an expensive innovation, but this is an innovation that kind of takes care of the political exigencies of pricing electricity in a situation where electricity has never been priced. In contrast is the state in West Bengal, where electricity was not made available for years and years. Since the last, 15, 20 years, the government has been actually able to give electricity to farmers, but all that is metered. So I think within Indian states itself, we find a wide variety of how the governments have been managing electricity and indirectly through electricity, managing groundwater. So that itself is a fascinating subject that I think it just fascinates me to know.
Yeah, it is fascinating with huge consequences, of course. And the example you gave of Punjab and Haryana, to my mind, that's an interesting jugaad, but an expensive one. It's not a frugal jugaad. To get around this political sort of minefield, they found a way around, but it's expensive, as you point out.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, certainly that was an expensive jugaad. While on the other hand, what happened in West Bengal was, as I was mentioning, that there was all this fear that because groundwater is so overexploited in Punjab and Haryana, there was a lot of fear in West Bengal, even though it had a very different geology, very different rainfall structure, very different kind of aquifers. The fear was that if farmers access groundwater, West Bengal would also face groundwater overexploitation. So West Bengal had this law that said that every farmer who needed to get an electricity connection needed to get a permission from the groundwater department. We know what happens in countries like ours when you need permission. So there was a lot of rent seeking, lots of transaction cost in for a smallholder farmer to get a permission to even get the electricity connection. So one of the work that I was able to do through CGIAR, through IMI, that's where I used to work in those days, International Water Management Institute, was to do a series of work that shows that if only electricity was metered, there would be no need for other kind of permit. And it just so happened that in 2011, I think it was, yes, a new state government came in, and we were asked to, through the Planning Commission, we got the opportunity to present our research. And what then the government did at that point was just change the groundwater law. They said that farmers would not need permission for electricity connection if they were in a safe block with safe groundwater levels, etc. And that eventually led to over 200,000 new electricity connections for smallholder farmers, a massive impact. So I think that all started with my PhD work in Cambridge that ended up creating real impact on the ground, which was, as researchers, there's nothing more satisfying than when your work gets taken up by policymakers. So that was literally the highlight of the part of my career that I've been most happy about, making a real change on the ground.
I mean, amazing story. Very rarely does a PhD work translate into something that you're also doing and then leading to a significant change. I mean, you said this is something that you're proud of. The world is proud of the work that you did in the platform, Climate Adaptation and Mitigation Platform. Tell us a little bit about that.
The platform kind of came as a part of the CGIAR reforms. There was this feeling that we at the CGIAR do so much of work in each of our 15 centers, and climate change is something that's cross-cutting across all the centers. We do such a lot of climate change work, but there isn't that one stop where you can go and actually know what the various centers of the CGIAR are doing. Those of you know CGIAR know that we are a decentralized structure. We have a system office, but all of the 15 centers are autonomous and they work, each one have their own mission and vision, and each one of them are set up by the governments in various countries. So the job of the platform then was to bring together all the climate related work that we do in the CGIAR as a whole. So to cut a long story short, the job of the platform was fourfold. It was to convene. By convene, we mean convene a community of practice of all the CGIAR climate scientists. And it turned out that in all the centers, we have around 600 climate scientists who work on various aspects of climate change, physical climate change, but a lot of it was in adaptation, mitigation kind of work. The second job of the platform was to deepen our own capacity and capacity of our partners with the latest of climate science. The third function was to amplify. By that, we mean that all the work that we are doing in the CGIAR and with our NARS partners, how do we use those work to influence global climate processes? So a lot of the work we did in the last 3 years was around using our science to influence UNFCCC processes. Like we would make submissions to things like global goals on adaptation. We would make submissions to the agriculture track of the UNFCCC. And our final function was like advising internally what else we can do, what is it that we are not doing. So in that way, the role of the platform was kind of an integration of CGIAR's climate work, and in some ways a place where everybody can come and see what is the work the CG has done, what has been the impact, that kind of thing. But those platforms have been now discontinued after 3 years, and they have been now merged with the other programs. So the platform as an entity no longer exists. But that was the kind of the work we did in the last 3 years of the platform.
We wanted to get down to some details, if you may. And one of the things that we have been understanding is that you need new varieties, right? Which are both resistant to climate change and also, in some cases, take advantage of the changing climate, right? The question is, how will these new varieties be developed? And I think one great example that is there in the reports that you published is rice. And obviously, it's a common topic for Jaideep, myself, and you. So maybe you can elaborate on.
Yeah. I mean, in some ways, if you look at the CGIAR, we started as a crop breeding institute, right? The green revolution of the 1960s and the 70s started with some of the high-yielding varieties bred both
of maize in Mexico.
Of maize in Mexico, exactly, and rice in Philippines, right? And so CGIAR has a long history of breeding improved varieties, and now that expertise is being brought into breeding climate resilient varieties. With rice, some of our improved varieties are around flood tolerance. So we are finding flood tolerance varieties have been able to raise yields even during prolonged submergence. We are already witnessing a lot more floods and droughts. I think we don't need to for you and for this audience, the impacts of climate change on agriculture. We just all know it and how increasing in scale and impact those are. So on terms of rice, I think there are some really nice innovations around flood tolerance. I think one is Swarna sub-tolerance 1, sub 1 they call it, which can deliver 1 to 3 tons of yield advantage even when the fields are submerged, and with no yield penalty in normal years, because that has been a challenge. Like, for example, often a climate resilient variety is very good if that year happens to be a flood year or a drought year, but it happens to be a normal year, then their production is suboptimal than the quote unquote normal varieties. But with this particular one that our colleagues in IRRI, that's the International Rice Research Institute. So there are 2 centers of the CG who do rice breeding. One is IRRI in Philippines, where Professor M.S. Swaminathan used to be the DG at one point. Majority of the cultivars we see in India, Bangladesh, South Asia, are one way or the other come from IRRI. And there is also another center, Africa Rice in Africa, which is a similar mandate for Africa. So there are lots of these kind of climate resilient varieties. As I said already, flood is a major issue in many of these rice growing areas. So the flood resilient varieties. Then the other thing is a lot of the work that the CG and the centers do are done with the NARS, with the National Agricultural Research and Extension Systems. So, for example, according to IRRI, 141 rice varieties was released in the last decade with IRRI support. So not even South Asia and India alone, and similar numbers are also there from Bangladesh, Nepal. This is kind of one of the major work that we are doing. I also wanted to touch upon some of the challenges. Some of the challenges that climate change is these days throwing up is that, for example, we and many others have a pretty good heat tolerant rice breeding or wheat or maize breeding varieties. But in 2022, what happened in India was the heat waves came on much early in the season. We expect heat waves in later April, in early May, but we were seeing heat waves happening as early as March. That's the time when the seeds start flowering. I am myself not a breeder, but my conversation with a lot of our scientist colleagues has been it's really difficult to breed something heat tolerant of a heat to 48 degrees centigrade during the flowering season. So basically, there are also limits to adaptation. For us, rice breeding, wheat breeding, maize breeding are excellent adaptation and mitigation measures. But as a climate scientist, I would like to put on table that there are real physical limits to some of these adaptations. And unless overall globally we also mitigate greenhouse gas emissions, unless we reduce greenhouse gas emissions, like some of those adaptations would be really hard, because my understanding is that we don't know how to breed that would still germinate when it's, or still kind of, yield fruit, yield grain when it's 48-degree during the flowering stage. So those are some of the physical limits we are reaching, and that's a matter of great concern.
I wonder if I could ask about the funding sources and how that impacts investment and innovation. So my understanding is a lot of the funding for like the CRISPR gene editing comes from venture capital sources. What does that mean for public organizations like CGIAR when they're developing these varieties for smallholder farmers who may not have the kind of purchasing power and give the kind of return that the venture capitalists are looking for?
I think in our context and for the CGIAR and for our centers, whatever work we do, it's public goods. So for us, it's a part of our mandate that our seed should be available at affordable prices to the farmers. So a lot of our work is also publicly funded. We are funded by all the major countries in the OECD, but also we are funded increasingly India, China, and also by a lot of the philanthropic organization. For example, the Gates Foundation is one of our largest funder, and they really support the breeding program. I think it's well understood that any funding that comes to the CGIAR has to be like what we produce is public goods. It doesn't have the same, I think, modality as the private venture capitalist. Having said that, I think CGIAR's funding has stagnated over the years. It has been a little less than a $1 billion a year for like several years now. And when you look at it, I was just talking to a public land grants university in the US. Just one university has a funding of $1 billion a year, and CGIAR works across 80 countries, 15 centers, literally some of the poorest farmers in the world. Right now, for everything, particularly in the development world, the funding situation is particularly constrained. So this is where I think, Joydeep, the kind of innovations, the frugal innovations would be so important going forward. How do we do better with less?
And what about the acceptance of these new varieties, the genetics? There are prejudices even in rational European circles about genetically modified crops. What are you seeing on that front?
So I don't think all our crops are like, we are not big into the genetically modified crops. We are more into the improved varieties. And we see that the adoption, while there are challenges, there's always those last mile reaching some of the vulnerable populations remains a challenge. But again, because we work closely with the National Agricultural Research and Extension Services, which basically have a wide reach among local farmers, some of the adoption rates are not as low as we might think about it. For example, CIMET, which is based in Mexico, and our main wheat and maize research center, some of the numbers that their work shows that under the drought tolerant maize in Africa project, they have produced nearly 54,000 metric tons of certified drought tolerant maize seeds, which has reached 5.4 million households and roughly 43 million people across 13 sub-Saharan African countries. This is a part of the impact evaluation. So the numbers are there, they're reaching those people. What requires is that continuous extension services, continuous innovations, and a lot of those innovations are also coming through various digital means. I understand a lot of applications of AI is in the offing. So while it remains a challenge, I think once farmers understand that some of the traditional varieties are no longer performing as well under a changed climate, I think there is this incentive to adopt these new varieties. But it won't be automatic. There has to be those extension services.
I think this point that you made about maize is something that I wanted to ask you because, again, obviously I'm not a scientist, but what I understand is that maize will not benefit from carbon dioxide fertilization. So that's one crop which is a serious risk.
Yeah, that is true actually. So, of all the crops, perhaps maize and to some extent wheat, but largely maize is what is already facing a lot of yield losses. So, some of the studies from the IPCC last cycle AR6. So, I was the coordinating lead author for the water chapter, but the result I'm quoting here is from the food chapter, where it shows almost 7% yield loss per 1 degree warming for maize. That's the empirical models that are showing that. And this is kind of, it does not take into account the losses due to droughts and heat stress. So that's kind of adds to it. So even the temperature rise of every 1 degree temperature rise would lead to 7% yield loss. And this is as per the last IPCC assessment report. Then we have also seen a lot of observed losses already by a few percent, anything varying between 5 to 7%. Again, that has already happened between 1980 to 2010. Again, while the future projections are not the same across the regions, because of course the rate of warming is different globally and regionally, I think Africa, particularly Sub-Saharan Africa, is quite affected because a lot of the maize.
Significantly affected because
Yeah,
across Southern Africa, Eastern Africa, which I'm familiar with, maize is the staple crop in
right.
70-80% of the cereal production. Is in that context,
Mm.
given all these, do you have some insights into the type of varieties that are being grown in maize?
Yes, some of the drought-tolerant maize varieties that I spoke about, and it has had quite a large impact in terms of adoption. But one of the issue is that a lot of these maize is also grown under unirrigated condition, and irrigation is one of the major adaptation that we are finding. It's a kind of an adaptation with pluses and minuses. The plus is, of course, it reduces the drought effect and the heat stress. But the minuses are many of these places also do not have enough water to support those very intensely irrigated maize cultivation. But having said that, the very fact that large part of Africa, 80 to 90% of Africa's irrigation is rain-fed, also adds to the risk of global warming because that's the choice adaptation by farmers. In South Asia, in North America, that's how farmers have been adapting. So that's an option that's missing in Africa. So I would think it's extremely important to have those kind of improved varieties like drought tolerant varieties. The fact that we also need to invest in the other part of it, like better irrigation, better water management. So we have to kind of look at the whole picture, and seed is a one component to it.
Yes, that's very interesting to hear that these things are interconnected. There's this nexus between climate change and adaptation, but also water, energy, types of varieties of crops, and so on. Something that we've encountered again and again in this podcast is lots of new ideas, new types of seeds, crops, new practices, and yet struggle sometimes to really get adoption. You've touched on that a bit, but can you tell us a bit more about what is your experience with what works when we are trying to get adoption of new solutions, whether it's new varieties or new practices?
When I look at from the climate lens, it's often actually bundled solutions. So like to not use too much of more complex language, it means that while from a scientist point of view, maybe we are trying to solve one particular problem, but a farmer faces many problems at the same time. So they are not only trying to solve the problem of loss of yield during a drought, they're also trying to solve the problem of lack of water. They're also trying to solve the problem of lack of marketing facility, lack of credit. So very often in the climate change adaptation literature, for example, we see that the largest impacts are when you are actually combining multiple solutions together. So it can't be just like one thing. It's not too different from, say, if we go back to the Green Revolution era, and most districts in India, if you remember, they were actually given a whole package of seeds, of irrigation, of fertilizers, of best practices and extension services. So just one thing did not turn the needle, right? So it's the same thing right now. Farmers, wherever we have been able to offer those kind of bundled solution of, say, insurance, of better varieties of seeds, of trainings for better water management, or investments in, say, solar irrigation, linkages to the markets, that's when it has really worked. So I think we as scientists have to work across those silos and bring the different parts of the solution together under one umbrella. I think that's really what's needed. It just can't be just the seed or the water. It has to be all of it all at once. So that's been my personal experience so far.
It makes total sense when you put it that way. But the people who are thinking in that way and then applying that logic, because I can imagine scientists like academics, we just focus on our area and we see the world from our lens and not necessarily looking at it from the lens of the person facing the problem. So who are the people in the system? Or we would call them entrepreneurs, but who are these entrepreneurs in your experience?
A couple of ones. I think as scientists, as academics, we have to absolutely come out of our own silos and really collaborate in ways that are interdisciplinary. We have to work as those. Well, I feel that we are all kind of detectives with one piece of the puzzle. And unless all the pieces of the puzzle comes together, all that happens is we publish more papers, which is not a bad thing. Publishing is fantastic, but it does not often lead to the solution on the ground. So I would think that, and within the CGIAR, for example, there is more and more emphasis on the impact we create on the ground. So I think like we are kind of going through as that mind change, how real world solutions work. The other one is our partners on the ground. NARS, for example, the extension agencies of the National Agricultural Research Institutes, they play an extremely important role. They know the people, they know the place. And off late, I think some of those new ICT technologies, some of the young entrepreneurs have also been playing increasingly important role. Having said that, and we have a lot of optimism around private sector, I don't really disagree with that. Sometimes I also worry a little bit about our over-reliance on private sector, given how little money our smallholder farmers make. And private sector has to make profit, right? That's their rationale. So I think while private sector can play an important role, we have to be very mindful of the small margins of these smallholder farmers. So I would think maybe the role of civil society can become even more important, role of entrepreneurial farmers themselves. And we have to think overall in a systems dynamics, and it can't be like I have a solution and farmers have to adopt it. And if they are not adopting it, maybe they are not rational, because that's not what they are. They are very, very rational, as we all know from our years of experience working with farmers. If something's not getting adopted, we have to actually understand why. And very often, because it's just one part of the solution, the farmers see more than we are able to offer.
Aditi, digital solutions, for example, which you have alluded to already, is something that the private sector has participated in. Adoption is not necessarily very skyrocketing, right? And you have probably done some things in which I'm very keen to know your adoption rates in digital solutions.
It's actually a great question. We have this very nice project called ICRA, which is run by the World Bank. The whole point of ICRA is to use some of the CGIAR solutions and scale it up to smallholder farmers in Africa. So we reach a lot of farmers. We kind of reach 2-3 million farmers through agro advisory services. And in the first phase, we did not necessarily know how many of those farmers that we reach then actually use those services to improve their outcomes. But some of the smaller scale studies that we have done, so these were not designed as impact evaluation from the very beginning, but some of the later post facto studies, ex post studies basically, have shown that some of the impacts have been large yield increases in targeted crops. Example, 41% increase in millet yields in some areas in West Africa, due to timely information that the farmers got, increasing whether to irrigate, whether not to irrigate, when to plant, what variety to plant. But having said that, I think we have also been doing some meta reviews. I think we need to design these studies in a way that we can capture, like it's not the same thing as getting the information. There is a next step, like whether that information is being used by the farmers on the ground. And we need to do better in terms of capturing those aspects of how farmers use that information, what are there for impacts. But some of the smaller studies are showing quite good impact on the ground. The other one that I wanted to talk a little bit about that we have, I think, quite encouraging results is the index-based livestock insurance. It is a very, very challenging product because you are targeting pastoralists who do not stay in one location. So this is a very innovative product of International Livestock Research Institute, where I'm based as a principal scientist now. And this year we have done some credible counterfactual based impact evaluation. And we found that it has produced measurable welfare gains for pastoralists, such as higher consumption, income stability during droughts, reduced distress coping, such as reduced sale of animals due to distress, etc. So there is all that emerging evidence. Perhaps there is a need for a larger database of these evidence, because this is just one among many such insurance schemes or many such early warning schemes that we have in the world. So yeah, and putting it in the context of the next IPCC AR7 cycle, I think there is this need to put these solutions up front, because in the climate change space, a lot of us feel a lot of disquiet that we know the reasons so well, we know the impact so well, but we do not know the solutions as well. We know what solution works here, what solution works there, but we do not know it in a comprehensive way. So I feel our next focus of all of us needs to be more solution oriented.
Aditi, coming back to this issue of funding, we talked about it in the context of varieties of new crops and so on. And wonder if the same issue applies here with digital solutions, because again, in the global marketplace, we see a lot of private sector interest in this space, a lot of venture capital investing, big companies involved. How do you see this playing out in the context of agriculture and smallholder farmers? Is there public funding, or are there partnerships between the private and the public sector and the users?
So a lot of the digital work that we do, Jaideep, within the various CGIAR centers are, like most of our work, through bilateral grants, through a lot of, again, through philanthropic funds. For example, again, Gates Foundation is quite a big interest in these kind of agro-advisory services. Then we also tie up with the national hydromet agencies. They are the ones who provide the meteorological forecast, the hydrological forecast. Then we also collaborate with the agricultural universities. They often, and within our own in-house capacity, we actually use those hydromet information to translate those into agri-advisories. Like what does, for example, high temperature mean for the crop growth, whichever growth stage the crop is. So that's something we do in-house, or we collaborate with the national agricultural universities and the agricultural systems. Then we also have partnerships with, say, the telecom departments of the governments. And that's where the private sector comes in, wherever we have private service providers. So how do we collaborate with them so that the SMS kind of reaches, bulk SMS reaches these farmers on a timely basis? And so that's where the private sector interface comes in. And some of our work, particularly with some of our centers like the IFPRI, the International Food Policy Research Center, and to some extent my own center, the ILRI, we have been also trying to figure out that we know that there is a digital divide. We know that women are less likely to own smartphones, or small marginal pastoral communities are less likely to own the kind of phones you would need for these services. So we've been also working a bit on that side of how do we reduce the digital divide on who receives information, who gets to act on it. So it's kind of a whole package where our collaboration works with the research institutes, with the hydromet services, with the private sector and the service providers. Last mile coverage still remains somewhat challenging because of those inherent digital divides that we are aware about.
I find this really intriguing, Aditi, because of the point that you alluded to earlier about partnership with civil society, because I would assume, I'm wondering whether my assumption is right, that you would be able to cross some of these digital divide solutions, especially on gender and socioeconomic classes, if you did partner with, for example, civil society. Does that happen as much as you perhaps wanted to?
Yes, I think partnerships with civil society are incredibly important. And we are increasingly seeing in so many countries, the civil society is also becoming very resource constrained. So I think that's a challenge we find in India, for example. But some of the civil society partnerships, I think, are very important in digital solutions. I was just thinking of some of the work that we have been doing with Seva in India. They have been very much focused on women's group, and a lot of those digital divides are something that they have been able to overcome simply because of the number of women that they have within their membership. So that has been, I think, one of our very, very successful partnerships. Many centers of the CG have worked with them. So I think I cannot overemphasize the importance of civil society. And I also note how difficult the work of civil society, particularly the empowerment kind of work that the civil society is doing in many countries. And that's something, along with the restrictions on research funding on topics like climate and gender, I think all of that is likely to aggravate in the next few years. That's also will be the time when the crisis becomes more apparent.
Absolutely right, actually. We've talked about, sort of technology-based solutions, seeds, digital solutions. There's a whole area of practice, soil and water conservation. Obviously, you have done work around that.
Yes. So as I think I earlier alluded to, that seeds and digital, these have to be apart. Like you cannot really grow anything without water or soil. So these are two fundamental parts of agriculture. And a lot of the CGIAR work that we do across various centers are, so some of our centers are more seed-based, commodity-based, and some of our centers are more natural resource management-based. So I used to work with the International Water Management Institute, where our mandate literally was agricultural water management. And there we have been working on, I think I talked about the groundwater work earlier on, but a lot of the work around how do we manage public irrigation systems better, how do we manage our aquifers better so that we recharge more water. A lot of our centers work on soil health. How do we improve soil health? How do we do so without adding emissions? Like how do we make the soil more fertile, but not necessarily by applying more chemical fertilizers, but more naturally derived fertilizers and manures. So that's the whole ambit kind of work of the CGIAR on water, on soil. And I'll be happy to talk about some of the particular work that we have been doing around solar irrigation, for example. We are finding, say again, if we come to South Asia, one of our largest cause of emissions within the agriculture sector is actually irrigation. And a lot of that irrigation is for groundwater. South Asia is the world's largest user of groundwater. We literally use 1/4 of the world's groundwater. So out of 1,000 cubic kilometers of groundwater that the world uses annually, 250 cubic kilometers are used in India alone. And if you add Pakistan, Bangladesh, that's easily crosses around 350 to 400 cubic kilometers. So anything between 25 to 40% is the share of use of South Asia. So we are incredibly dependent on groundwater irrigation for our food security. And that groundwater irrigation is possible right now. We are using a lot of fossil fuel. It's either diesel run or it's through electricity from dirty coal-fired thermal power. So actually, how do we transition from that kind of fossil fuel-based irrigation systems to low emission or no emission irrigation systems? So some of the work we have been doing is around solar irrigation. Before my tenure at CGIAR, I used to lead a solar irrigation project in 4 countries in South Asia. And we have very interesting insights around how, if we can have a grid connected solar pump, like the solar pump is connected to the grid, then farmers actually get a choice between how much water to use for irrigation versus how much electricity to sell to the grid. So all of a sudden, the farmer is no longer the consumer. The farmer is a producer as well as a consumer of electricity, solar electricity, and they're making these very smart decisions. So that kind of becomes a powerful tool. We found farmers in, say, an arid part of Saurashtra in Gujarat. The moment they realize that the monsoons have failed, and they would know that within the first month, like July, August, they would already know if the monsoon is good or bad. And when they realize that the monsoons isn't quite up there for the groundwater to be recharged adequately, many farmers decide not to cultivate at all that year. Instead, they use all their solar electricity to sell it back to the grid and earn some income.
Interesting point. And I wanted to just link that back to your water work. And
Right.
theoretically, if farmers, stop cultivating, that is one way of adapting, if you may. But I did read a very influential, shall I say, World Bank economist, Soumya Balasubramanian, who produced this report saying that the use of solar water pumps in India, unless sort of monitored, could actually lead to the depletion of groundwater resources. I wonder what your comment around that is.
I think, yeah, Soumya was a colleague of mine at EME and we have worked closely together. Soumya's work was at a period when the literature was just emerging, and we now have more evidence to say that that might not necessarily be so if we have those kind of grid connected kind of systems. So standalone solar pumps, they can lead to kind of problems of groundwater overexploitation, though not necessarily, because at the end of the day, with a solar pump, you can only use it for 5 or 6 hours. And with a diesel pump, you can possibly pump for 24 hours. The solar itself has some kind of limitation in how much you can pump. But more importantly, the moment you link the solar pump with the grid, what happens, and then you have a reasonable buyback power scheme from the farmers. Basically, you are paying farmers, so farmers are making this decision whether to pump or whether to sell the electricity. And we are finding that farmers are making increasingly good and smart decision. A number of papers are in various stages of publishing. I think some have been also published recently, actually shows that the impact on groundwater is not as negative as some of the earlier literature surmise that they would be. So those earlier literature was also kind of drawing on from the previous regime of flat tariff. So solar irrigation is almost like a flat tariff. You have zero marginal cost of pumping. But then what is different is that if you have 24 hours of free electricity, you don't have that with solar. You without a battery, and batteries anyway cost prohibitive, you just have 5 to 6 hours of actual solar energy that you can to pump water. So I have a little bit of different opinion whether solar would necessarily lead to groundwater overexploitation. I think it's a very much an empirical question. And some of the early evidence that is coming from some of the projects we are doing is that with the right incentives on the ground, actually solar power can be a good incentive, like particularly grid connected solar can be a good incentive for farmers to use less groundwater. And we are finding that indeed in some of our empirical cases.
One of the key things that is whether we can have a food secure future while reducing emissions and living within our natural environmental constraints. There are different perspectives on this. Some are all doom and gloom, and some are excessively optimistic. Some suggest moonshot solutions. Some, like us, think more about frugal solutions, lots of them. What's your take on that? Are you optimistic, pessimistic? And what are the reasons for that?
I almost put myself in a cautiously optimistic situation, but if we don't stop emissions, I think, increasingly move into the pessimistic camp. Just let me first say that food systems are responsible for 1/3 of the emissions. There's no doubt about it. But then some of the food systems emissions are a little bit also harder to abate. So I want to answer it in two parts. First and foremost is the fossil fuel. We have to absolutely move away from fossil fuel, and we have to decarbonize, go to net zero emissions in all those sectors. Like energy, for example, is basically the top sector where we have to move to a low emission net zero as soon as possible. So there's no doubt about it. And then agriculture, yes, 1/3 of the emission. Here, I think our major constraint is not that we don't have technologies. Many of those technologies are not yet as cost effective. For example, the very fact that solar panels are now solar electricity is now cheaper in almost all the countries in the world compared to thermal. In India, for example, your per unit cost of solar production is much lower than from your coal plants. The reason is not an happy accident, right? 30, 40 years of research has gone into producing those panels that are becoming increasingly cost competitive. We have not seen equivalent amount of research in our sector on low emission technologies. A lot of our research has traditionally focused, and we are a part of it, has traditionally focused on, say, high yielding seed varieties. It has focused on increasing production. Only now, maybe last 10, 15, 20 years, when we are kind of more conscious of the emissions that our sector causes and how can we have those technologies that are both low emissions but also does not affect productivity. We recently did a report called the Breakthrough Agenda Report, where we highlighted 7 of those technologies. For example, in the fertilizer sector, you have green ammonia. It's a great technology, but still it's not ready for smallholder farmers. So the point I'm trying to make is that it's possible for us to reduce emissions, but we are not ready yet because we have not put in the requisite amount for research and development that we need into this. So we need to do more R&D to get those low-cost solutions that actually work for smallholder farmers. But in the meanwhile, the major onus on reducing emissions still remains on the energy sector, particularly followed by the transport sector, by the urban high consuming populations. And perhaps the onus on the smallholder farmers for reducing greenhouse gas emissions is a little lower because they are not historically responsible for those emissions. It's very important to know that ultimately we have to go to low emissions technologies also in agriculture. There's no escaping that.
And what about fertilizer, for instance, which is, in a sense, based on fossil fuels as well?
So, no, with the fertilizer, the recent report that we did, the Breakthrough Agenda report, the CGIAR led that into the 2023 and 2024, and I was the lead author for that. Here we have looked extensively into some of the available fertilizer technologies. So green ammonia is increasingly becoming a technology that could be market ready in the next 5 to 7 years. Challenge would still remain delivering to the smallholder farmers in the global south where we work. Another technology which is more suitable in our context is something called site-specific nutrient management. So right now, traditionally, the ag services, extension services have been providing fertilizer use advisory based on rule of thumb, but that needs to change. So now with better technologies, with better ICT kind of technologies on farm, the ability to do better soil mapping actually means that we can balance our fertilizer application based on what is lacking in that soil. So that's basically what the site-specific nutrient management is about. And we see that we can actually reduce the amount of fertilizer that we are using without at all affecting the yields. Actually, in some cases, yields also increase because we are targeting those fertilizers much more effectively. It's kind of a pathway from going to kind of zero emission green ammonia kind of fertilizer to also using fertilizers better and more efficiently. Again, the situations are very different. South Asia, China overuses fertilizers, while Africa barely uses fertilizers. So there's a lot of those balance that needs to come in when it comes to fertilizer management.
Do these solutions have to be different in the global south versus the global north, and especially if you bring in livestock as well?
Yes. At the International Livestock Research Institute, we have recently started a hub called the Livestock and Climate Solutions Hub, and where we are actually trying to say that the major livestock discourse overall in the climate world in the IPCC is all that we have to reduce the livestock numbers, which is absolutely true. But that also comes from a global north perspective, where we are seeing that there is an overconsumption of animal source foods. So some of the European numbers are average person in Europe consumes around 70 to 80 kilos of animal source food per person per capita in a year. In the US, those numbers are in the range of 130, 150 kilos per capita per person. And these are like literally a human being doesn't need that much of animal source food. On the other hand, in sub-Saharan Africa, the numbers are as low as 10 kilos per person per capita.
And declining as well in some countries.
Exactly. Affordability is an issue. So it's also declining. It's very low in Ethiopia. So these are some of the real issues. So you cannot have the same discourse. So eat less meat is something you just cannot say to an African smallholder farmers who has a stunted child. The child stunting can be entirely preventable through a healthy, nutritious diet, and animal source protein, animal source food is an important part of that healthy, nutritious diet. So a lot of the work we do here in the ILRI and in the global south is around making that discourse much more clearer, that there is a nutrition deficiency. So what the world needs to do is that where there is overconsumption is happening, Those are the parts of the world which have both the moral but as well as the health wise. It's just wiser to eat less meat, and the parts of the world where there is a lack of nutrition because the lack of accessibility and affordability to the food needs to eat more of that meat. So that's the one we are looking at. We are looking at the balancing between overconsumption and underconsumption. So obviously the narratives have to be really different because our entry points are really different.
I wanted to move away from meat a little bit to talk about fish. And in that context, ask you one important question, which bothers me a lot. While we talk about climate change impacts, right, rising temperature, drought, stress, I also worry a lot that it is not climate change, but it's what you in IPCC call the environmental stresses, non-climate, which is basically local environmental damage. And particularly, the reason I bring this up in the context of fish is that you can promote fishery, which is what you've done, but it's local governance issues that really inland fisheries.
Yes, I agree with that, and with both fish as well. So we have a center called World Fish, which is headquartered in Penang, and that's the majority of the work is around aquaculture, but also marine fisheries. So a lot of the work we end up in doing are the local governance issues. So there are issues around pollution of the water itself, for example. So part of it is linked to some of the agricultural practices. A lot of the nitrogen that is applied to the soil leaches out into the water, causing all kinds of water quality issues. So that's, of course, the localized problems are important, and it's very important for us in our context not to sweep everything under climate change, because what also increasingly happens with policymakers is, like, if it sounds like it's a climate change problem, then they do not see how they can solve it immediately. They kind of take, okay, maybe we are not entirely responsible, maybe somebody else is responsible. But a lot of those problems are actually local decisions, local infrastructure. Maybe moving away from fish. I used to work in a mountain institute in Nepal. Maybe I'll give you a insight from the mountains, like springs. Like, I lived in Nepal, and in all the Indian Himalayas or all the Hindu Kush Himalayas, it's so surprising that they have so much of water. Basically, it's all the glaciers. I mean, those glaciers feed those 10 mightiest river in Asia. But the reality is, if you are in a mountain village, your only source of water is a spring. And all those springs are, large part of those springs are drying, not necessarily because of climate change. Climate change certainly has a role, but they are largely drying because of this infrastructure kind of, I almost call it a craze that we have, the hydropower boom in all our mountains. Right now, I think in newspapers and TV, every day we are seeing the kind of devastation that's happening in the Indian Himalayas. So both hydropower as well as road construction, what they're essentially doing is they are just disconnecting the recharge area of the spring, charge area of the spring. So the springs are no longer filling up. Even if they're filling up, they're not kind of, discharging water, because the connection between the two has been broken by a dam or by a road. So a huge amount of some of our local level impacts are infrastructure, around pollution. So I think that's a very important distinction that you're making there, Shanjoy, about local level decisions versus the climate change, which is kind of more collective.
Aditi, this has been obviously incredibly interesting, and you've covered such a large ground. This is a podcast about climate change and food security, but it's actually a podcast about food. And I suspect you have some favorite foods from your city that you and me grew up in.
Yes, yes. We are both from Kolkata. It's a city that I really, really love. My absolute favorite fish is hilsa. And I don't think as a Bengali that comes as a surprise. I don't get hilsa here, but my second best then is salmon. When there's no hilsa, go for salmon.
I think it'd be very nice if you could just explain why people get so emotional about that fish and what type of fish it is.
Yeah, I mean, it's it's quite funny that how emotional we are about a fish and how fish can make headlines in the place we come from. But hilsa is this fish that lives in the ocean and then comes to the river to lay its eggs, in which way it's kind of similar to salmon. It's the same family of fish, a very bony fish. It's something quite iconic among the Bengalis. Very recently and very surprisingly, I learned that it's also a very popular fish in Iraq, for example. They also have hilsa. They call it something else. Then a colleague from Pakistan told me that they also eat hilsa, but they are all called different names in different places. It's just an incredibly tasty fish, and we have various things you can make out of it.
If people want to get in touch with you, how should they?
They could email me, a.mukherjee@cgiar.org, and I'm also there on LinkedIn. Not so much on X/Twitter anymore, but my profile exists there as well at Aditi Mukherjee.
Thank you very much, Aditi.
Thank you so much, Aditi. It's been a fascinating conversation.
Yes, same here. Thank you for having me.